Back to raw politics. Now, a tech summit in Portugal is underway, and the kind of web we want for the future is on the cards. One of big tech's most formidable adversaries, Justice Commissioner Vera Jourova, delivered a speech calling for tighter regulation of the cyber world. Here's what she had to say.
It is time to stop foreign actors with the specific aim to disrupt our elections and spread mistrust of our democratic institutions. Europeans are worried that their elections are being rolled out in an unfair manner. We need the transparency of online political advertising to be guaranteed. We need improving the protection of personal data in the electoral context. We need to protect elections from cyber attacks, and we need to improve national and European cooperation on potential threats to European Parliament elections.
Well, back with me is our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, and joining us for this panel is Eva Kaili, a Greek MEP from the Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, and Andrew Byrne, the Sunday Times EU correspondent. All right, we have Jourova speaking in that, and she's talking about technology, the state of technology. Is it killing democracy?
Well, I don't believe it's threatening democracy. It's too democratic at this point. We were not prepared for too much democracy, maybe. I think what we have to do is to have digital literacy to understand if our perception is being manipulated. This is the most important thing. And when we talk about fake news, I'm a bit scared because it actually means maybe ban content. And the Ministry of Truth is not something that we need. We need more options. We need to make sure that technology will provide us with the correct options and a news feed that it's going to be personalized, but it will not alter our perception of reality.
Is there such a thing as too much democracy? Go ahead.
Well, I don't know what we have now on the internet. I don't know if democracy is the best term for it. I think we're only scratching the surface of what's happening out there. I think last week Twitter revealed that it had deleted 10,000 bots in the US that were posing as Democrats, urging other Democrats not to vote. And then in May and June, I think there were something like 70 million fake accounts on Twitter taken down alone. So we're only, I think, scratching the surface of what's going on. And you've got to ask, by the time we've discovered there's a fake account on Twitter or whatever platform takes it down, how many more Twitter fake accounts have been set up to take their place? So I think we need a lot more detail. I think Eva's right that we can't have a sort of a Ministry of Truth approach, but I think we're going to have to lean on these actors to be a lot more strict about policing fake content.
Actually, we spoke a lot more with Commissioner Vera Jourova at the Web Summit in Portugal. We asked her why the web needs regulation and how it can be kept free at the same time. Let's hear what she had to say.
We need better protection against the waves of disinformation and panicking messages and news which cause big hysteria and fear in the society. That's why we say in Europe, let's take all the necessary measures, preventive measures, but at the same time, censorship is not a good choice. Regulation which would kill free choice and free development of digital world would go to the detriment of our society. So speaking about smart regulation, only what's necessary and proportionate, I think it's the best choice we have. This is about protecting pluralism.
All right, she used words there like fake news, hysteria, fear. I mean, so is regulation the
in some ways, that's hysteria. I think it's to the point here where is it good that people have access to information and they have access to more information than they've ever had before? Yes, that's a good thing. Second of all, do we have to trust people that they're going to be able to work out what a bot is? And the thing is, people talk about these bots. How clever are these bots? Are they really able to convince people necessarily not to vote? I'm not entirely convinced they are.
We've had major newspapers quoting these bots in stories as real sources. So actually quite sophisticated people, although not all of us journalists are perfectly sophisticated, but many of us have been fooled by these bots. So I think doing nothing is hardly the right choice.
I don't think it's necessarily good to be drawn through Twitter trying to get... and also, I think, we talk about Twitter a lot, for example. Not that many people actually use Twitter in the grand scheme of things.
True.
And I don't think it necessarily... But most of all, who judges the polarity?
Exactly.
Who decides what is fake news and what isn't? even in Europe, does Viktor Orban get to decide what fake news is, or does Emmanuel Macron? I mean, that's the crux of this.
Yeah, so
who gets to decide?
Eva, you were thinking of regulation, but can people trust governments and authorities to
because
regulate?
You don't know what a government wants, and you have to be lucky to have a good government to control that. That's why I said we should not have ministries of truth. What we have to do is to make sure we're going to provide options to citizens. So basically to give them the other side of the story and then the education for them to decide. And we're trying to provide them with scientific data and evidence-based information so they can have clarity and actually to respond immediately to something that becomes viral, because virality is the main problem. It doesn't actually have to be bots. If something becomes viral because it's isolated and some people try to have this become viral, we are lacking to respond very fast, and this is what we have to fix.
And obviously, we're talking about all of this in the context of elections coming up and election meddling. I mean, these are important issues to bring up at a time like this. Right. Well, the inventor of the web, he's also worried about the future of tech. Tim Berners-Lee, he's launching a campaign calling for a so-called contract for the web. He spoke to CNBC at the Web Summit in Lisbon. Let's take a look.
A lot of people are realizing that things are not the way they maybe could be on the web, and lots of people have to get together, hence the contract, to work. So governments, individuals, companies need to make sure, push the web in particular ways towards it being more truthful, more creative, more constructive, more democratic. But even though you might have these large silos, the silos shouldn't dominate your life. You should be able to move from one to the other. You should be able to operate with data from wherever it comes from.
Yeah, so Andrew, have we gone so far from the original purpose of the internet that we have to rein it back in and have a contract?
Well, I think, when the web was founded by, 29, 30 years ago, it made sense that this was a new liberal space where there wouldn't be government control and it could create new opportunities. But I think 30 years later, I think it's no longer acceptable to have the web used for promoting terrorist content, extremist content, to have levels of misinformation that is perhaps undermining the democratic basis of society. And I totally have the point. I'm not an advocate of censorship, but I think what we're witnessing now is the internet maturing, and regulation has to mature with it.
To what, Darren, you mentioned earlier, the fact that we raised the point of hysteria is in itself hysteria. Is the perception of election meddling, for instance, or interference itself dangerous? The idea that we think
yes, I think it is,
rigged.
and I think in some ways you could say it's damn ironic that you've got European leaders talking about foreign interventions and foreign influence in elections when, Europe's been involved in that for many hundreds of years. I mean, even look at Russia, for example. Western governments are involved in Russia in funding pro-democracy movements. Now, whatever you might think that's a noble cause, and it may well be a noble cause, but to Russians, that is election interference.
It's
that's
exactly what that's the difference, right?
Well,
between
I'm not entirely sure it is. I'm not entirely sure it is transparent
effort.
Because, we don't know who these groups are. All I'm suggesting is that I'm slightly uncomfortable because, you look at China, you look at other Saudi Arabia, Iran, countries that do control the World Wide Web. And I'm not entirely sure that they're in a better position than we all are. Look, and when it comes to it, we look at Donald Trump, we look at Brexit. Are we really suggesting that it was the internet that swung those referendums and that election?
We are looking very closely at the midterm elections happening in the United States, and because Americans are heading to the polls today for those elections. Experts have warned that misleading information posted online is worse in this election than in 2016. Alex Morgan in the Cube has more on this. Alex.
Tessa, yes, 2016, of course, a presidential election. These are midterm elections. But just yesterday, Facebook put out this statement. They say, we are taking action. We've been really concerned to deal with law enforcement to make sure there's no election interference. And they say they've identified a number of accounts on their sites. They say early stages, 30 on Facebook that may have been involved in coordinated inauthentic behavior, and 85 on Instagram. Now, this is being presented as Facebook taking action, but these numbers are very, very small, it's fair to point out. Also, this statement just saying may have engaged in this kind of behavior. The Facebook accounts here are predominantly in Russian and in French, so a focus on foreign actors. But it seems this time around, the focus really should be on the scale of domestic junk news. At least that's according to the Oxford Internet Institute. They put out a report saying in the lead up to this election, 25% of all the news being consumed in the United States is coming from domestic junk news sources. Junk news, not fake news. Let me break it down for you. I asked the researchers, why do you call it junk news, not fake news? They say fake news has been weaponized, especially in America. I mean, it's fair to say it is a political weapon now. Instead, they define junk news as sources publishing deliberately misleading, deceptive or incorrect information, particularly coming from ideologically extreme or hyper-partisan positions. They have a number of criteria. There's 5 criteria to meet. They say if it meets 3 of those, they classify it as junk news. And they conclude that this time around, junk news, 25% of the news being consumed is this junk news. Now, when it comes to classifying things like hyper-partisan, politically extreme, these are, of course, loaded terms. So I asked the internet researchers, I said, well, hang on a minute, how do you respond to the claims that what you're putting out here, effectively calling sites junk news, is different from people calling it the misleading mainstream media? This is what the report author had to say. Well, she said, we typically see sources from across the political spectrum sharing these junk news sources, saying they've worked up this criteria for 2 years, looking at Europe, Latin America, and America. But they say here, in the United States, it does tend to be sources leaning towards the right that are accounting for the most of these junk news sources. But just a final thought for you, Tessa. In a conference call this morning, Department of Homeland Security saying, despite supposed misinformation campaigns, they haven't seen any specifically targeting voters today or the voting processes. So one thing to be concerned about, but we'll see, obviously, how this election goes.
Thank you for that, Alex and the Cube team. And we're speaking about messaging in times of elections, referendum, and specifically Brexit. Europe's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, he gave a speech, a message in Brussels last night, and he told us a story about a recent conversation he had with Nigel Farage. Take a look.
Dites-moi, Monsieur Farage, vous avez été en tête du combat du Brexit, vous avez gagné. Nous sommes en train de délivrer le Brexit, c'est l'objet de cette négociation. Est-ce que je peux vous demander comment, à la fin, après le Brexit, vous imaginez, comment vous voyez-vous les relations entre l'Union européenne et le Royaume-Uni? Et il m'a répondu ceci. Monsieur Barnier, après le Brexit, l'Union européenne n'existera plus.
Tongue-in-cheek there from Michel Barnier.
Yeah, I mean, Nigel Farage is always one of ambition, I suppose. You could put it that way. I think what is interesting is that speech last night. He again made it clear that, yeah, we're nearly there, but we're not there yet. And we are getting to the point now, or certainly in the next couple of weeks or so, where if there isn't a deal, we are going to start moving into no-deal territory. And it has to be said, that is not good news, obviously, for Britain and for the European Union. But it's not good news for Michel Barnier as well, because he spent 2 years trying to
not going to have the answer.
No, well, I'm not. No, he hasn't. But of course,
sure.
He's in charge of the negotiations.
Absolutely.
I mean, Nigel Farage, obviously he sort of predicted there would be no EU after Brexit, It would fall apart. And I think, those who thought that Brexit would be the first domino to fall, I totally agree, and no-deal Brexit is bad for everyone, including Michel Barnier. But those who thought Brexit would be the domino falling of the EU collapsing, you look at the opinion polls around Europe, it seems to have surprisingly had the opposite approach. It's a response. It's galvanised.
It's the one issue that's united the rest of the European Union.
Isn't that ironic? Indeed. All right, after the break on Raw Politics, why French President Emmanuel Macron says Europe needs its own army. Don't go away. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, Europe needs an army to protect itself against Russia, China, and even the United States. That was the stark message delivered by France's Emmanuel Macron today. Since rising to the French presidency last year, he's been calling for greater defense coordination. But this is Emmanuel Macron's most explicit call for an EU army so far. Take a look at what he said in an interview with the French radio station Europe 1.
Nous devons nous protéger à l'égard de la Chine, de la Russie et même des États-Unis d'Amérique. Quand je vois le président Trump annoncer il y a quelques semaines le fait qu'il sorte d'un grand traité de désarmement qui avait été pris, je le rappelle, après la crise des euromissiles au milieu des années 80, qui avait frappé l'Europe. Qui Qui en est la victime principale? L'Europe et sa sécurité. On ne protégera pas les Européens si on ne décide pas d'avoir une vraie armée européenne.
All right, well, I am back in the studio with our panel, Darren McCaffrey, Andrew Byrne, and Eva Kaili. All right, Eva, does Europe need an army?
Of course it does. You know, we are at the borders of Europe, so Greece and Italy suffered the most from the migration and refugee crisis, and the threats we have also from a NATO ally like Turkey. I think it's something that if we want to deal with, we have to be together with the rest of Europe. And of course, for several countries, it's important for the borders close to Russia. So I think having a European army will actually make all these problems become European problems, because they are too heavy for Europe and for Greece and Italy themselves. And you saw the results with our elections.
Is that the right?
I mean, of course, Europe needs an army, but of course, Europe already has several armies, right? And it has a NATO alliance. I'm inclined to cast a cold, cynical eye on Macron's comments. You know, he is completely exhausted. It's reported his poll numbers have slumped, and so desperate times call for desperate kind of statements. This EU army call is a regular refrain of politicians. It allows you to look visionary,
or maybe they're testing the waters for a real, actual army.
I don't know. It's been said so many times, and it never happens because European countries have found it so difficult thus far to cooperate. If you look at common security and defence policy, it's been among the most disappointing of areas of integration for federalists. And I think, you know, ultimately, you know, if you take one example, for instance, there was a lot of talk about the need for a common European external border guard to deal with the migration crisis. 3 years later, after the most poisonous political crises, where is this external border guard?
It's on its
just
way,
not going to happen.
Apparently. Yeah, I mean, and that's the problem with Emmanuel Macron. It's lots of big vision stuff. Yeah. He keeps talking about what Europe needs is more Europe. He wants to see greater integration in the Eurozone. He wants to see a European army.
Look, he's not alone in that.
Well, no, but come on, 18 months in, there's very little evidence he's actually achieved any of this. A European army has been talked about for an awful long time. And yes, in the context of Donald Trump in the White House and seemingly the undermining of NATO, it might seem like a good idea. But are we realistically going to get there anytime soon?
Actually, we are, and somebody has to be bold about it. So I like that he talked about it. It was not the case. We didn't even talk about that.
I'll just bring in, because Emmanuel Macron, he's not alone, as I was saying, in this idea and pushing it forward. You agree with him, in fact. Well, Macron appears to have a powerful ally in his vision for this European defense. We have German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and it was the election of Donald Trump, in fact, which led her to say it is no longer such that the United States simply protects us, but Europe must take its destiny in its own hands. That's the task of the future. All right, I do want to point out...
we have committed 13 billion for... this is a proposal of the Commission for a European Defence Fund. So we're actually doing something about it.
You could dig out quotes from Gerhard Schroeder, from Jacques Chirac, from any number of former German chancellors or French presidents calling for EU armies. And it just doesn't happen for good reason.
But we didn't have Trump and Brexit. Now we do. And now we have also Turkey. And I think we have to get our things together.
But I think I just want to point out the difference in what Merkel wants. She wants a defense army, but Macron wants an army that actually goes abroad. So there's a difference in then protecting yourself.
There have been military excursions where actually soldiers have, represented the European flag. No, I'm not suggesting they're very big.
Missions,
but they are,
yes.
They are small missions. But ultimately, Andrew's right, this has been talked about for a long time. I do not see that Emmanuel Macron saying it on the anniversary or the centenary of the First World War. It's a political kind of thing to roll out every so often. It's expedient at the moment. Are we going to get there? I don't think so.
First, we have to start talking about it. So I like that the conversation started, and it started actually with a lot of funding.
Who's going to pay for it?
But if the funding is there, because the proposal seems it's going to pass, and the MFF is going to be drawn now before the end of this mandate, this means we have headquarters here. We're starting to do something about it.
You've got billions less because Britain's leaving. The demands on the European budget have never been greater.
Exactly.
I cannot imagine it's going to...
25% of the defence of the possibility of Europe to defend itself leaves with UK, which means we have to do something about it.
No, because it's still part of NATO. It's still part of NATO.
But Turkey is there too.
as you were saying that Europe's more united after with Brexit happening.
It's moving faster. We are moving faster.
Very briefly, yes.
Emmanuel Macron needs a poll boost. He needs to revive his figures ahead of the elections, and this is just another.
You're really skeptical about the army.
Said that the greatest argument for it happening is Britain leaving because it's been the biggest opponent of it happening.
On that note, well, let's go to today's raw moment. You may